Is there an Islamic creed?
One short, two-part statement sums up the essentials of Muslim belief. I confess that there is no deity but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. In this testimony called the Shahada, confession or witnessing, Muslims affirm the two foundational elements from which all other beliefs and practices flow. First, they assert that only the one, transcendent, Supreme Being called Allah in Arabic can claim the full allegiance of humankind. Allah means literally the deity, or what ordinary English usage calls God with a capital G. Allah is therefore not a distinct name for God as such, but the primary designation for the Absolute, the deity above all other powers both spiritual and worldly. Affirming God's absolute oneness is called Tawhid, pronounced Tawheed. Second, Muslims attest that human beings know of the Supreme Being through the agency of prophets, the last of whom was Muhammad. This profession of faith is the first of the 5 pillars of Islam. Along with almsgiving, daily ritual prayer, fasting during Ramadan pronounced Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca. All of which will be discussed later in detail. Muslim religious scholars between about 750 and 950 formulated a number of other, more detailed creedal statements. But none has been as widely known as the Nicene Creed among Christians or the 13 Articles among Jews. Those later Islamic creeds developed largely as correctives to theological positions that arose during Islam's early centuries, views that the creeds formally repudiated as unacceptable.
How does the Shinto tradition determine specific days for festivities?
Carrying on the Chinese custom, Shinto tradition has designated certain days, each month auspicious and certain others inauspicious for religious celebrations. The days most favored include the 4 each lunar month that correspond with the new and full moons, the 1st and 15th, and waxing and waning half moons, around the 7th/8th and 22nd/3rd. Since solar months are longer than lunar months, festivals that retain the same day and month numbers they once had in the lunar calendar, e.g. 7th of the 7th, do not always correspond perfectly with the lunar event that originally made certain days auspicious and others not. Calculation of the beginning of a festival day begins with the eve of the feast, Yoimatsuri. Special days begin at sunset on the eve and last through sunset of the actual festival day, Hanmatsuri. Japanese call the actual day of a feast Saijutsu. Large-scale annual matsuri associated with a particular shrine, such as observance of the anniversary of the shrine's founding, are called reisai, regular festivals. These are distinguished from lesser festivals or national occasions such as those associated with the imperial household.
What and where is Arabia?
The Arabian Peninsula is an enormous land mass that makes up the south-central portion of Western Asia, also known as the Middle East. It is now home to the nations of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and United Arab Emirates, and several other small so-called Gulf states. Arabia is bordered on the west by the Red Sea, on the south by the Arabian Sea, and on the east by the Persian Gulf. Mostly desert, the peninsula is larger than Iran and Iraq combined, twice the size of Egypt, and about 10% larger than Alaska. Total population today is just over 20 million. Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia, the peninsula's largest nation-state. Jeddah is the Red Sea port that serves the holy city of Mecca, Muhammad's hometown. Medina, the second holy city, is about 200 miles north of Mecca.
What are trigrams and hexagrams?
Trigrams are sets of 3 vertically stacked horizontal lines made up of every possible combination of broken and solid line. Solid lines stand for the solar male yang, hot, bright, active, and dry. Broken lines stand for the earthy and lunar female yin, which is dark, moist, mysterious, and associated with valleys. Combinations of yin and yang in varying proportions give rise to the 8 essential elements in creation. Traditional presentations usually arrange the 8 trigrams as an octagon, at whose center stands the Taiji symbol for perfect yin-yang harmony. Each trigram is arrayed so as to face its opposite in the set. So for example, if you held a compass before you with north pointing up, heaven's 3 solid lines would stand across from Earth's 3 broken lines at what would be north and south. At due east stands water, with a solid line between a pair of broken lines, across from fire, with its broken line sandwiched between solids in the west. At northwest, lake's broken solid, reading from top to bottom, stands across from mountain's solid broken. And in the northeast, wind's solid broken balances off thunder's broken solid. Take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in all possible permutations by stacking one trigram atop another, and you get 64 hexagrams. Pile heaven upon heaven and the result is called the creative principle. Add earth to earth and you get the passive principle. Earth over heaven yields peace, while heaven over earth means stagnation. The single most important source for interpreting these arcane indicators is the I Ching, the classic of change. Tossing and rearranging a set of 50 sticks and then reading them as hexagrams with the help of that text remains a widely popular form of divination.
Why is the land of Israel so important in the history of the Jewish people?
Israel is the homeland of the chosen, or covenant, people. It is the land to which God led Abraham. God chose the people of Israel in love for a mutually binding agreement. The obligations of the covenant were formalized in Torah, with Israel bound in obedience. Today, Israel remains the focus, the land of destiny for many Jews. Thanks especially to God's own statement that He chose the people of Israel as His treasured people and consecrated them to Himself. The land of Israel therefore holds a special place for Jews as both a gift from God and as an enduring and tangible sign of the covenant.
What rites do Buddhists practice at home?
Many devout Buddhists pray daily at home before their domestic shrine. A miniature version of the temple or monastic oratory. They show reverence to the image of the Buddha with incense, flower offerings, and a lighted candle. All three of these simple symbols bring home the central realization of impermanence. They give pleasure to the worshipper, who should enjoy them while they last. Unburned incense is analogous a person who does not use his or her talents. A lotus flower is a reminder of the Buddha's being rooted in the muck of real life but blossoming above it and in spite of it. These symbols also represent homage to the Buddha, not because the Buddha needs or enjoys that, but because it focuses the mind on his message. Rituals also include reciting the three refuges and reaffirming the commitment to the 5 precepts. Prayers of petition include the same sorts of things people of many traditions ask for: happiness, success, longevity, and salvation. Mahayana devotees might wear a small rosary around a wrist, as they often do when worshipping in the temple.
What is comparative religion?
Comparative religion draws on the information supplied by all available sources for the history of religion. Scholars look for possible parallels between one tradition and another in the belief that common themes can offer insights into how the traditions developed and how their teachings differ or reinforce one another. We can talk, for example, about what kinds of beliefs and practices are characteristic of a tradition, how various communities of faith are organized, what sorts of signs and symbols a tradition uses to express its central teachings, and what kinds of special calendars different traditions follow. Comparative religion is not just about looking for similarities. Differences are every bit as important. And in the end, what we're seeking is greater insight built on an overall picture that is as fair and balanced as good scholarship can provide.
What is Confucianism and who were the literati?
Confucianism refers to the system of social, ethical, and religious beliefs and practices associated with Confucius. The term does not imply the worship of Confucius as a supreme or central deity, but it does acknowledge his foundational and pivotal role in the cultivation of beliefs. and practices that have remained important in many Asian societies for centuries. Some scholars suggest that we replace Confucianism with literati tradition, to indicate that the complex of beliefs and practices now generally attributed to Confucius is actually part of a broader cultural phenomenon. Literati, the Latin for the lettered, educated, is a name coined by non-Chinese scholars to describe the cultural elite most influential in promoting and preserving the Chinese imperial system. The literati were the highly educated, professionally specialized bureaucrats who maintained the far-flung governmental structures of the empire. They also functioned as the ritual specialists in the many religious ceremonies performed under imperial auspices for sponsorship.
What is the Bantu religion in ancient Africa?
The Bantu were among the most prominent peoples of ancient Africa. Originating in West-Central Africa, between the savanna and the forest. The Bantu began migrating south and east around 1200 BCE, ultimately spreading along the east coast. By 1000 CE they had reached central Natal, in what is now the country of South Africa. Religion touched every phase of human experience in ancient sub-Sahara Africa. Specific beliefs varied from tribe to tribe, but some general tenets were common to all. Most Bantu-speaking people believed that the dead continued to influence the lives of the survivors. Ancestors were believed to remain in spirit, deserving respect and concern from the living, who might welcome them at meals or soothe them when they were angry. Sub-Saharan Africans also recognized many spirits identified with natural forces, both kind and dangerous. Most of these societies also believed in a supreme being as the highest power, the source of all excellence and virtue, but far removed from human understanding.
How do monasteries function in Buddhist life?
During the early centuries of Buddhism, monks and nuns lived as itinerant beggars with no fixed abode. The practice of staying put during the monsoon season gave rise to permanent monastic institutions. Monks and nuns lived either in viharas, separate structures, or dwellings carved like caves into hillsides, guhas. Many early monasteries functioned somewhat like parishes, offering spiritual services to the local population. These smaller, more pastorally oriented monasteries were eventually replaced by larger monastic complexes with a focus on learning. Many monasteries, especially in Theravada lands, still offer educational services to the people of the area. In general, Theravada monasteries throughout Southeast Asia maintain somewhat more active links with the outside community than do Mahayana monasteries. Japanese Zen monasteries, for example, still focus on a life of seclusion and solitude. Tibetan institutions have until recently been the virtual backbone of community life on the roof of the world and were home to an extraordinarily large percentage of the male population. Some monasteries are now part of what one might call consortiums, with as many as 24 individual temple monasteries of the same denomination clustered within one larger institution. Most classic monasteries are walled enclosures divided into private and public areas. Monks' residences and private ritual spaces are separated from the ritual and educational facilities that serve visitors.
Has pilgrimage ever figured prominently in Jewish practice?
In biblical times, Jewish males were expected to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem for 3 occasions: the feasts of Passover, booths, and weeks. Special ritual requirements attended each of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. But since all were tied to the existence of the temple, pilgrimage as a specific religious duty lapsed during the exile and again when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. Throughout post-biblical Jewish history, Jews in the diaspora have continued to pray about Jerusalem and have longed to return to it. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, many have realized the dream of one day visiting the site of the temple and praying at the Western Wall. Strictly speaking, modern-day Jewish pilgrims are not fulfilling a biblical injunction, since the temple remains only a memory. But pilgrimage has in effect assumed a new form for many Jews. For most it is a journey of remembrance of a former dispensation and a chance to connect with deep roots. Some journey in the hope that they may live to see the glory of the temple and its associated ritual practices restored.
What is the connection between orthodoxy and heresy, and what is heterodoxy?
Orthodoxy, from the Greek orthodox, correct opinion, is in a way the diametric opposite of heterodoxy, Greek, heterodox, variant opinion. Heterodoxy is a generic category used to refer to any and all doctrinal views at odds with mainstream thinking in a tradition. Heresy, from the Greek herio, to seize, choose, decide, in other words, to take a position, is one of the more common ways of characterizing heterodox views. In general, heresy refers to the deliberate holding of a set of beliefs in direct opposition to a religious tradition's established and widely accepted authority. It is important to keep in mind that fully articulated conceptions of orthodoxy typically develop long after the earliest generations of a given tradition have come and gone. During their early decades, even centuries in some cases, many religious traditions have historically allowed for some diversity of views. But one or another of those views can become so extreme that a majority of believers perceive a threat to their cohesiveness as a community. To hold such a threat at bay, religious communities sometimes find it necessary to define the limits of acceptable divergence of beliefs. The term heretical has sometimes been used to describe certain sectarian movements that form in response to restrictive definitions of orthodoxy.
Does that mean Hindus do not believe in heaven or hell?
Traditional Hindu cosmologies speak of three realms of existence or lokas. One scheme describes an in-between realm, Antarloka, where individual souls abide both during sleep and between incarnations. This reflects the persistence of important features of ancient Vedic views of the cosmos. A version of hell called Naraka, literally, referring to humankind, is a thoroughly unpleasant lower part of the Antarloka that functions rather like a purgatory. In any of its 7, or even as many as 21 levels, souls can overcome through suffering some of the effects of bad karma. A multi-leveled region called Anandloka, realm of bliss, also called Svarga, region of light, is roughly equivalent to a paradise or heaven. It is a temporary abode in which people who have died approaching liberation acquire knowledge that can assist them toward greater spiritual progress in their next life. Hindu cosmology includes multiple levels, both in this in-between realm and in the uppermost realms beyond that reserved for those who have achieved moksha. Most Hindus regard the intermediate equivalents of heaven and hell as temporary, although some smaller sects teach the existence of more or less permanent abodes of punishment in the next life.
Do Muslims allow interfaith marriages?
Muslims generally prefer that their sons and daughters marry members of their own faith tradition. They officially allow marriage to members of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, and Christianity. But most still consider it acceptable only for Muslim men to marry non-Muslim women. And then it is assumed that the non-Muslim party will agree to raise the children as Muslims. Among the 8 million or so Muslims living in the United States, the practice of Muslim women marrying non-Muslim men has been increasing somewhat lately.
Who are some of the principal Shinto male deities, apart from those mentioned in the primal myth?
Hachiman, generally identified as the kami of war, is near the top of the pantheon. It is no surprise that he often appears in painting and sculpture as armed and dangerous. But some of the most famous images portray Hachiman as a meditating monk or a solicitous bodhisattva. Almost half of all officially listed Shinto shrines, some 50,000 or more, honor Hachiman. A curious grouping called the Seven Gods of Good Luck, Shishifu-kujin, brings together figures of mixed background. Daikoku, sometimes called Daikoku-ten, hails from India, mythologically speaking, and probably traveled to Japan with an early influential Buddhist founder named Seiko. Daikoku is associated with accomplishment of one's goals and with wealth. Stone statues show a jovial bruiser with a sack over one shoulder, sitting on bales of rice and wielding a mallet with which he grants wishes. Also a god of prosperity, Ebisu is popular especially in fishing villages, rice farms, and local marketplaces. Ebisu is deaf and fails to hear deities being called together for his own October celebration. Like Daikoku, Bishamon, also Bishamontan, is of Indian origin. In the Hindu pantheon he was one of the four heavenly guardians, presiding over the north. In Buddhist as well as Shinto iconography, Bishamon is heavily armed and holds a miniature pagoda in his left hand as a symbol of his authority. Fukuro Kuju, who originated in Daoism, stands for happiness, fortune, and long life, as his name indicates. When depicted in the arts he looks very much like his Chinese counterpart, Xiao Lao, generally accompanied by a crane or deer. Like the next god of good luck, Jurigen. He also has a walking stick to which he has attached a sacred text. Jurigen is another patron of longevity of Daoist origin. Hodei, likewise drawn from the Daoist pantheon, stands for happiness and wealth. Benzaiten, also known as Benton, is the lone female of the bunch. The septet of good fortune kami have been a favorite subject. 4 popular and charming miniature carvings called netsuke. A large number of kami are associated with forces of nature. Fujin, kami of wind, carries a large bag, and his companion kami of thunder. The menacing red-faced Raijin, or Raiden, holds a massive drum. A generic group of minor deities called Dosejin protect travelers ever since Izanagi brought them into being upon his return from the underworld. A kami called Koshin is one protector of travelers, but some also identify him with farming. His 3 monkey partners have become popular as see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil. Kami keep watch over every conceivable feature of ordinary life. Sujin, a god of water, guards wells and other water sources. For water is the principal means of purification and an essential of life.
Who are the main Hindu religious officials or specialists?
Traditional Hindu vocabulary includes dozens of technical terms to designate virtually every imaginable variety of religious function or specialized qualification. Essential to every Hindu temple is its priestly staff. Larger temples often have many priests, sometimes called pujaris, those who engage in the daily worship called puja on the staff, one of whom generally serves as chief or senior priest. People generally address priests as Shri, the equivalent of reverend. Frequently but not exclusively of the Brahmin caste nowadays, temple priests marry and have families. At temples that have become important pilgrimage centers, specialists called pandas serve as pilgrim guides and keep records of the families who make up the regular membership of the temple. Ritual specialists called Purohitas, those who lead, are generally Brahmins of the Smarta denominations who do mostly home ceremonies for Brahmin families. Gurus, who are generally learned Brahmins, still almost exclusively perform the various samskaras, or rites of passage, and tutor upper caste children in the ancient traditions.
Have Confucians traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Confucius was genuinely convinced that his ethical views and integrated approach to just government under the dominion of heaven had much to recommend them. He himself was a zealous advocate and spent much of his life trying to convert others to his interpretation of the human condition. When at length the Confucian system took hold as the theory behind the practice of imperial administration, the bureaucratic structure itself became the mechanism that spread Confucian thinking far and wide. Diplomatic relations with other lands became a network for the export of the Confucian way. But neither Confucius nor his most influential disciples were populists. Instead of preaching to the masses as missionary movements typically do, Confucians have espoused a trickle-down theory. Convince the leaders of the value of Confucianism and they in turn will spread the word to their subjects. Persuade those in authority to model the good society. Given appropriate official sanctions and incentives, the people will see the benefit of establishing proper relationships at every level.
Did Shinto tradition spread beyond Japan?
Shinto has gone as far as Japanese emigration and military expansion have carried that ancient tradition. You'll see the occasional Shinto shrine in various parts of the Pacific Basin even now. Reminders of a time when Japan projected its imperial presence beyond its shores, where Japanese communities have taken root and continue to grow, especially during the last 50 years or so. Older people especially take comfort in celebrating at the nearest shrine for festivals. But on the whole, Shinto has remained about as purely Japanese a phenomenon as one can imagine. Even in parts of the United States, for example, where now sizable communities of Japanese descent make their homes, traditional Shinto priests are exceedingly rare. Some suggest that Shinto anywhere but in Japan is a contradiction in terms. Shinto remains, ideally, a tradition inseparable from the very soil of Japan and its sacred streams, groves, and mountains.
What are monks and nuns?
A surprising number of religious traditions include several different options or styles of affiliation for their members. The vast majority of members in every tradition belong to the broad category often referred to as lay persons. Within the orbit of the larger communities there are generally numerous social organizations of an ostensibly religious orientation open to lay believers. But another, more restrictive, category of membership is available, for example, to virtually all Buddhists, many Christians and Hindus, and to Muslims in a number of regions where various Sufi groups thrive. These organizations are often called orders or confraternities. The Buddhist Sangha is arguably the oldest continuously functioning order of its kind on earth. Dating to the late 6th or early 5th century BCE. In some traditions, these orders have devised separate but parallel structures for men and women. Two very different lifestyles have been important in the history of monasticism. When members live together in community at all times, they are called cenobites, from the Greek koinos and bios, common life. Those who choose to live alone or as hermits are called anchorites. From the Greek anakorein, to withdraw. Many of the orders originate as small circles of devotees gathered around a charismatic figure. In the case of Buddhism, the foundational figure himself. Some eventually grow into complex organizations with elaborate hierarchical systems of succession to leadership and authority. Larger orders often split into suborders, with members breaking off and founding their own groups, either because of a disagreement over spirit or practice, or to simplify administration and governance. Orders typically develop a system of training, beginning with a period of apprenticeship in which the novice or aspirant learns the order's ways and demonstrates aptitude for the life. Attaining full membership, the monk, or nun, or brother in some cases, assumes ordinary responsibilities and shares fully in the community life. Some are asked to perform internal administrative duties, and become part of the governance structure. Orders can be either local, with only one or a few houses in a city or region, or more widespread, with foundations worldwide governed from a central administrative office. Some traditions also have organizations that serve a population whose religious commitments place them somewhere between lay and professionally religious. These are sometimes called third orders. Theology as a concept in the 3rd century Mediterranean world. The term theology was generally used by the Greeks to describe the character of theogones and to designate critical studies of Greek mythology. Plato in the Republic, Aristotle in his Meteorology, and Cicero in the Nature of the Gods, came to approximate the later historical use of the term. The Neoplatonists, however, seem to have been the first to consider theology as the science of God. The term is altogether missing in the New Testament and in the Apostolic Fathers. Early stirrings in the development of the concept of theology are to be found in the writings of Irenaeus of Lyons and Clement of Alexandria. The former was one of the first Christians to attempt to impose a rational economy upon God in his recapitulation theory. And the latter's Stromata was an early attempt to impose order upon divine revelation in general. The apologists, themselves educated as philosophers or lawyers, especially felt the need to present the educated pagan world with a philosophically coherent expression of faith. While Justin Martyr attempted judiciously to weave Platonism into the Christian scheme, Tertullian developed the technical terminology to be employed by subsequent theologians. Hippolytus, the first Christian to employ the word theologian, was seriously concerned about launching an orderly investigation into the psychology and economy of God. In the 3rd century, Origen, molded in the concepts of Middle Platonism and to some extent of Stoicism, greatly influenced the emergence of theology as a sophisticated, philosophical pursuit. The apostles, he felt, left the grounds of their statements to be examined by those who had the charismata of the Spirit. Knowledge of the divine world, wisdom, skill in technical tools, and holiness of life. His express aim was to erect a clearly stated connected body of truth based on illustration and argumentation and arrived at by the correct method. Even the title of his great work, On First Principles, betrays his intention to deal intelligently with God and heavenly beings and with men, the material world, and free will and its consequences. Origen was forced to rely heavily on the use of allegory to resolve contradictions, explain difficult passages, and correct misstatements purporting to be facts.
What is a scapegoat?
We use the term scapegoating to refer to any attempt to shift blame onto some person or group in order to escape consequences for oneself. In religious studies, the term applies to the ritual transference of guilt or evil intent, and it implies that those affecting the transfer are aware of their complicity in the performance or furtherance of some evil act or condition. Chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus describes perhaps the best known example of the ritual use of a scapegoat. God instructs Moses as to how his brother, Aaron the priest, is to perform the ritual of atonement for sin. He must take 2 goats and cast lots to decide which will be sacrificed. After sacrificing the one, he must lay his hands on the live goat, confess all the people's sins upon the animal's head, and send the goat out into the wilderness. Through this ritual transferal, the guilt of the whole community, once acknowledged, is purified from its midst. Ironically, Jews themselves have often been the victims of a more tragic scapegoating through history. Scapegoating now typically involves projection of evil and ill intent onto a hapless but convenient other. Sad confirmation of the adage that we hate most in others the very things we cannot face in ourselves.
What were the accomplishments of the Ming dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming dynasty. 1368 to 1644 CE, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a brilliant flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself meaning bright or brilliant. It was architects working during this period who produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people. In 1644, the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912.
Do Christians engage in exorcism?
Many readers will be at least vaguely familiar with a novel called The Exorcist, or with the movie based on it. The author based his story loosely on a now legendary series of events said to have taken place in St. Louis, Missouri some 50 years ago. Exorcism has long been available to Roman Catholics as a ritual designed to free individuals thought to be possessed and tormented by evil spirits. Church authorities have very rarely given permission to perform exorcisms, and only after extensive psychiatric and medical consultation. The local bishop appoints a priest known for his sanctity, sanity, and personal strength to act as the principal ritual specialist. That exorcist then prepares to use a set ritual and to subject himself to whatever spiritual discipline may be necessary to withstand the rigors of the experience. Peculiar and frightening occurrences are said to accompany exorcisms. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit priest who performed the St. Louis exorcism, refused ever to speak of the experience in public, except to affirm that he did indeed believe in the existence of the devil. According to the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles performed a number of exorcisms, a practice not altogether rare among Jews and pagans of the time. His actions are the ultimate sanction for the practice in Roman Catholicism. During medieval and even into early modern times, some people were executed as witches because they proved impervious to exorcism. Until about 30 years ago, Roman Catholic practice continued to confer on candidates to the priesthood the minor order or office of exorcist. Exorcism remains relatively common among some Christian denominations, especially Pentecostal or charismatic groups. Leaders of worship might perform an exorcism as one among many manifestations of the Spirit, by prayer and touch intended to free the one possessed. Here exorcism is generally a very brief part of the larger ritual. A much simplified form of exorcism remains a brief preliminary part of the ritual of baptism in many churches.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
Are Mormons Christians?
Members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints consider the Bible a critical sacred text. And, as their official name suggests, consider themselves Christians. Anyone who visited the New Mormon Temple in St. Louis prior to its dedication in 1997 would have been impressed by the prominence of a huge statue of Jesus in the entrance tent. But one of Mormonism's central tenets presents a major problem for mainstream Christian tradition. That tenet is the belief in a prophet after Jesus, with its implication that the revelation of Jesus was not final and definitive. Mormon tradition regards the work of founder and prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. 1805–44, as a necessary corrective to centuries of corruption of the true Christian teaching of Jesus. Smith himself believed the scripture revealed to him, the Book of Mormon. Origin of the popular name of the church, did not replace the Bible but merely supplemented it. Today the majority of Mormons live in Utah, while most members of a branch called the Reorganized Church are headquartered in western Missouri.
What do Hindus think about history and time?
Imagine a bird flying past the Himalayas every 100 years, brushing the mountain peaks with the silk scarf it holds in its beak. What we call history is the time it would take that bird to wear the mountains flat. And that would be only an infinitesimal fraction of divine time. History is an infinite cycle made up of smaller, measurable cycles of creation and destruction, but even the smaller cycles are unimaginably long. Hindu myth says that God, manifested as Brahma the creator, unfolds the material world over and over. Each lifetime of Brahma lasts 100 divine years. Each day in the life of the creator deity is called a kalpa, lasting 4,320,000,000 years. Each kalpa, or great age, Mahayuga, in turn is made up of 4 ages or eons called yugas. The present cycle of human history began with the first yuga, a time of order and peace when the cosmic law, Dharma, kept evil in check. During the second age disorder entered history. Dharma diminished as did the span of human life. There followed a third age, when evil gained still greater strength and dharma weakened. Social fragmentation gave rise to the caste system and attempts to gain power through ritual sacrifice. We are now in the fourth and bleakest age. A time of darkness and lawlessness destined to end in 400,000 years. Then, after a period of quiescence, all will begin again, another day in the life of Brahma. Key concepts in Hinduism: Atman, the indivisible and indestructible spiritual center of each being, and the ultimate self underlying all reality. Avatar, a crossing over downward, a deities, especially Vishnu's descent into the world of human experience. Bhakti, participation, devotional relationship to one's chosen deity, a major path to liberation. Brahman, ultimate reality enveloping all appearances of multiplicity. Dharma, that which holds all things together, the cosmic law, religio-social propriety. One's individual religious duty, and one of the four acceptable goals of life. Jnana, knowledge, insight into the spiritual meaning of things, one of the principal paths to liberation. Kama, pleasure, one of the four legitimate goals of life. Karma, action, ritual, or ethical conduct and the consequences thereof. One of the traditional paths to liberation. Marga, path, way, method of spiritual progress toward liberation. Moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, ultimate goal of Hindu spiritual practice. Samsara, journeying, the endless round of rebirth from which Hindus seek to be free. Yoga, joining, harnessing, system of physical and spiritual disciplines practiced by a yogi.
How do Jews celebrate birth?
When God made a covenant with Abraham, Genesis 17. The removal of the foreskin of the penis was to be the sign of its ratification. Circumcision of baby boys generally occurs on the 8th day. Performed by a specialist called a mohel, who is often a rabbi, in the baby's home. After the surgical procedure and accompanying prayers are completed, participants bless a cup of wine. Parents then declare the child's name. Reform communities now have a parallel home ritual to welcome baby girls, including all but the surgery. Other congregations still generally perform the naming ritual for girls in the synagogue. Some still give children two names, one religious, in Hebrew or Yiddish, and one secular. In addition to these early rituals, a ritual of redemption of a firstborn son also occurs on the 31st day of his life. The practice arose from the biblical teaching that each firstborn son belongs to God but can be bought back, Numbers 18:15-16. In general, the ritual is tied to the residual importance of the hereditary priesthood. For it requires a Cohen, or descendant of the biblical priesthood, to perform it.
What is religious Daoism and what are its origins?
Daoism refers to a wide range of philosophical, religious, and magical traditions dating from perhaps the 4th century BCE in China. Here the focus will be on the specifically religious aspects of these complex and ancient developments. The most ancient roots of the tradition were in shamanistic cults dating back perhaps several millennia to prehistoric China. Legendary imperial figures of that age, Yu, Shun, and Yao, are still revered as great sages. According to legend, Daoism formally began with Lao Zi's writing of the Dao De Jing, the classic of the Way and its power in the 6th century BCE. Scholars now believe the Dao De Jing actually dates from between 300 and 250 BCE. Teachings of the Dao De Jing came together with those of thinkers like Yang Zhu, 340 to 266 BCE, and Zhuangzi, 369 to 286 BCE, to form the broad conceptual basis of a wider Daoist tradition that had become largely philosophical, Daoqia, by the 4th century BCE. But religious Daoism, Daoqiao, was still a long way off. Solid scholarly research suggests that Daoism as a religious tradition begins in the mid-2nd century CE. It seems a teacher named Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE, claimed that Lao Zi himself commissioned him to spread the teaching of the Dao. Zhang inaugurated the 5 bushels of rice movement, a reference to the suggested offering for would-be members, and built a religious polity in Sichuan province. According to legend, Zhang Daoling's emphasis on acquiring immortality culminated in his ascension into the heavens. Out of that movement grew the first and one of the most influential branches of religious Daoism, the Celestial Masters School. Religious Daoism has since developed numerous sects and schools, each with its distinctive emphasis on various spiritual teachings and ritual practices.
What does Jesus mean to Muslims?
Jesus is the last of the prophet messengers before Muhammad. Muslims consider him a great teacher, but not more than a human being. Jesus appears in a total of 15 surahs of the Quran. By God's direct intervention, he was the son of the Virgin Mary who spoke as an infant to defend Mary from those who accused her of immorality for becoming pregnant without a legitimate husband. The Quran refers to Jesus as servant of God, Spirit of God, and a word from God. God taught Jesus wisdom, gave him knowledge of the Torah, and strengthened him with the Holy Spirit. Often associated with the angel Gabriel, the revealing angel. Among Jesus' special gifts were the power to raise the dead and heal the sick. Tradition says that Jesus ascended to either the 2nd or the 4th heaven. A special element in Muslim teaching about Jesus is the belief he was not actually crucified. Instead, a look-alike took his place at the last minute, Quran 4:157. But another text mentions his death and resurrection, Quran 19:33.
Do Christians mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Christian places of worship, generally called churches, almost always have one immediately identifiable feature, namely, a cross. Eastern churches often display a cross with distinctive short, sometimes slanted, bars above and below the main horizontal crossbar. Many also have one or more spires that have traditionally held the church's bells. Although the bells of most churches rarely mark all the hours of the day as they once did, some communities still mark the beginning of services by tolling them. Church designs today are remarkably varied. Some employ medieval or classical models, some favor the simplicity of early American colonial models, and some represent the latest in avant-garde architecture. One symbolic feature of many traditional and contemporary designs alike is the arrangement of the interior space in the form of a cross. A metaphorical shape that has been fairly popular in modern churches is that of a ship. Recalling ancient images of the church as Peter's bark. A feature of many churches is an antechamber or vestibule that marks a transition between outer and inner worlds. A brief passage that might allow worshippers to shift mental and spiritual gears. Interior features vary from one denomination to another. Catholic and Episcopalian churches, among others, typically have an altar table near the back wall. Almost all have one or more podiums, possibly well elevated. One of them will be called the pulpit, from which the preacher delivers the sermon or homily. Christian churches generally arrange their spaces for open visual communication between the sanctuary and the body or congregational area. Orthodox, such as Russian, Greek, Armenian, and Serbian, and some other Eastern churches often lack the benches or pews found in most other churches. They also typically have a high screen, called the iconostasis, that hides the congregation's view of actions that take place at the altar behind it, emphasizing the mysterious nature of the ritual.
Do Muslims believe in the devil?
Within the larger category of jinn are many beings who were once angels. The principal diabolical figure is called Iblis, pronounced Iblees, from the Greek diabolos. God ordered him to do homage to the newly created body of Adam, but Iblis refused, arguing that a creature of fire need not bow to one made of clay. God banished Iblis from paradise and he became the personification of the choice for evil over good. It was Iblis who tempted Adam and Eve, Quran 2:35-39, 7:19-25, 20:120-121. Tradition also names the devil Shaitan, Shaitan, and often refers to many Satans. The lesser minions of Iblis who fan out to beset humanity with temptations of every kind. Some of Islam's mystics have focused on the story of Iblis' fall as an occasion for discussing the infinite mercy of God. As evil as the devil is, they argue, even Iblis still has hope of enjoying the transforming power of divine forgiveness at the end of time. The mystics are not suggesting that the devil is soft on sheer nastiness. Only that no power in the universe can compare with God's mercy.
What does the term Babylonian exile, or captivity, refer to?
The kingdom of Judah had come under military and political pressure in the late 700s BCE. Around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom. Some southern kings even paid tribute as vassals to Assyria. In the year 597 BCE, the Babylonians, successors to the Assyrians as the major regional power, were closing in on Jerusalem. Though the city would hold out for another 10 years. The invaders captured and deported to Mesopotamia a number of leading Jews. In 587/6 BCE, the Babylonians laid final siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple. They and other Middle Eastern powers had found it useful to take important Jews into exile. The better to demoralize the subject peoples and ensure the success of the conquering regime. Exact numbers are impossible to reconstruct. But the total deportation seems to have uprooted as many as 20,000 people. Since only the poorest and least educated were left behind. The exile amounted to a virtually total elimination of Jewish presence in Jerusalem and its environs. The good news was that the community would realize the possibility of taking root in a new land. Prophets preached a message of encouragement and survival. Devising a whole new exilic theology built around the hope of restoration and return. Enter the Achaemenid Persian Empire stage left, exit Babylon stage right. Jewish fortunes changed under the new sovereigns of the central Middle East. In 539 BCE, Persian monarch Cyrus the Great decided to release the captives and allow them to return to Jerusalem.
Do Jews mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
In many parts of the world, Jewish places of worship have developed architecturally in the context of the local culture. The one architectural feature that sometimes distinguishes synagogues from nearby religious structures is that synagogues often have a central dome. Many mosques and churches have domes as well. But domed churches typically also have some sort of tower or spire, and mosques have a minaret or two. Synagogues with central domes rarely have prominent flanking towers. A common decorative item that can mark synagogues externally is the twin tablets of the law, a reminder of Moses' reception of the revelation at Sinai. A large Star of David often graces the facade or windows. Synagogues of more contemporary style often place a menorah of monumental scale, and sometimes even very abstract design, in front. One small but remarkable synagogue, that of Jerusalem's Hadassah Medical Center, Boasts a striking array of symbolic decor. Famed artist Marc Chagall designed a series of 12 windows to adorn the upper walls of all four sides of the room. Each of the windows recalls one of the 12 tribes, coordinating each window's colors with the intensity of natural light available through the day on the various sides of the space. Chagall arranged the windows roughly in order of the age of the patriarch from whom each took its name. As the sun makes its round, it illumines each in turn. Chagall placed Reuben, the oldest, on the east, and Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest, at the other end of the sun's circuit. Each window is bursting with Chagall's own unique choice of symbolic reminders of the stories of each tribe.
Do Muslims revere any persons as especially gifted with wisdom?
In Islamic tradition, as in Jewish and Christian, King Solomon, Suleiman, is the paradigm of wisdom. Solomon's sagacity enabled him to communicate with creatures of every kind, so that his sovereignty encompassed all of creation. Another figure from pre-Islamic history known for his wisdom is Luqman. Some traditions include him among the ranks of the prophets, but he is best understood as a prince among Muslim sages. According to the Quran, one chapter of which bears his name, Luqman was a teacher and coiner of proverbs. Walk at a moderate pace and speak in measured tones, he advises. For the most annoying of voices is that of the jackass, Quran 31:19. Islamic lore describes Luqman in ways that recall the Greek sage Aesop. Wisdom did not cease with the passing of the ancients. Muslims have continued to discern in teachers, scholars, and spiritual guides the embodiment of a practical insight that goes far beyond mere intellectual understanding. God has entrusted certain individuals with the gift of wisdom, the ability to penetrate the veils of life's mystery and to untangle the snarl of daily experience.